The morning of February 8, 1942, broke over Singapore with an oppressive humidity that made the air itself feel like a physical weight pressing down on everything and everyone. The temperature had climbed past 85 degrees Fahrenheit before 7 in the morning, and the sun was still low on the horizon, promising another day of stifling tropical heat that would make the cockpit of any aircraft feel like a metal oven by noon. Squadron leader Tim Harper stood on the tarmac at Kallang Airfield, his flight suit already damp with perspiration, watching the sun climb through layers of gray clouds that promised rain but never delivered relief. The air smelled of aviation fuel, hot metal, and the faint trace of smoke from cooking fires in the kampongs that surrounded the airfield. His Brewster Buffalo sat behind him at the edge of the dispersal area, its stubby fuselage and outdated design a stark reminder of how unprepared the Allied forces were for what was coming from the north. The aircraft looked almost comical compared to the sleek lines of modern fighters, with its barrel-shaped body, short wings, and the oversized radial engine that gave it the appearance of being perpetually nose-heavy. Tim had been flying the Buffalo for 4 months now, since arriving in Singapore from England in October of the previous year, and in that time he had developed a complicated relationship with the machine. It was tough, he had to give it that. The Wright Cyclone engine was reliable when properly maintained, and the airframe could absorb battle damage that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. But it was also painfully slow to accelerate, mushy in the controls at high speed, and had a tendency to lose altitude and sustain turns that could prove fatal in combat. The Japanese had been advancing through Malaya with terrifying speed over the past 2 months, their Zeros dominating the skies with a combination of maneuverability and firepower that made the Buffalo look like a relic from another era, something that belonged in a museum rather than in active combat service. Tim had lost 3 good men in the past week alone, each one dying in the cockpit of a plane that couldn't match the enemy's superior technology. Flight Lieutenant David Collins had been the first, shot down over Kuala Lumpur while trying to intercept a bomber formation. His Buffalo had simply been too slow to catch the bombers, and too clumsy to evade the escorting Zeros. Sergeant William Hughes had been next, killed when his engine seized during combat due to overheating, a chronic problem with the Buffalo in the tropical climate. He had managed to bail out, but his parachute had failed to deploy properly, and he hit the jungle canopy at fatal velocity. The third, Pilot Officer Michael Stevens, had been shot down just 3 days ago during a routine patrol, ambushed by Zeros that had been lurking in cloud cover. His last radio transmission had been calm, almost resigned, as if he had known from the moment he saw the enemy fighters that his Buffalo stood no chance of survival. Each loss had hit Tim hard, not just because they were his men, but because he felt responsible for sending them into combat in aircraft that were so clearly outmatched. He had written letters to their families, the most difficult task any commander faced, trying to find words that would honor their sacrifice without revealing how futile their deaths had been, how they had died not because of any failure of courage or skill, but simply because they had been given inadequate equipment and impossible orders. At night, lying in his bunk in the officers' quarters, he would replay each engagement in his mind, searching for something he could have done differently, some tactical insight that might have saved them. It was during these sleepless nights that he had begun to develop the ideas that would shape the morning's engagement. He wasn't alone in his assessment. Every pilot at Kallang knew the Buffalo was outmatched. Officially designated as the F-2A Buffalo, the aircraft had been rejected by the United States Navy as inadequate for carrier operations. What Britain and her colonies received were the leftovers, planes that had already been deemed second-rate by their original designers. The Buffalo was heavy, sluggish in turns, and prone to engine overheating in the tropical climate. Against the legendary Mitsubishi Zero, flown by pilots who had been honing their skills over China for years, it was like bringing a knife to a gunfight. Yet here they were, expected to defend Singapore with equipment that barely functioned in the best conditions, let alone combat. The morning briefing had been grim, held in a cramped room that smelled of stale coffee and cigarette smoke, with maps of Malaya and Singapore covering every available wall surface. Wing Commander Davies, his face showing the strain of command with new lines around his eyes and gray hair that hadn't been there 2 months ago, had laid out the situation with brutal honesty that bordered on despair. They were outnumbered by a ratio of at least 5 to 1, outgunned by aircraft that could fly circles around their Buffaloes, and operating with equipment that was breaking down faster than the ground crews could repair it. Intelligence reports indicated that a major Japanese formation was expected to attack the airfield before noon, likely as a precursor to the final ground assault on Singapore itself. The city's water supply had already been cut. Civilian casualties were mounting daily from aerial bombardment, and it was only a matter of time before the British command would have to make the decision that everyone knew was coming but no one wanted to acknowledge. But they had orders to defend Singapore at all costs, and so defend they would, even if those costs included their own lives. Tim had volunteered to lead a flight of 4 buffaloes to intercept whatever came their way, and Davies had accepted with a nod that spoke volumes about the hopelessness of their situation. His wingmen were Flight Lieutenant Graham Morris, a 24-year-old Australian from Perth, who had been flying since he was 16 and had more natural ability in the cockpit than anyone Tim had ever met. Graham had a wife back in Australia, and a daughter he had never met, born just 2 weeks before he shipped out to Singapore. He flew with a photograph of them tucked into his flight suit pocket, and Tim had seen him looking at it before every mission, his fingers tracing the outlines of faces he knew only from a grainy black and white image. The second wingman was Sergeant Jack Patterson, a Scot from Glasgow with a thick accent that sometimes made radio communication challenging, but whose loyalty and courage were beyond question. Jack was 31, older than most fighter pilots, and had served in the RAF since 1932. He had a dry wit that could lighten even the darkest moments, and a reputation for being able to coax performance out of damaged aircraft that other pilots would have abandoned. He had already made 3 emergency landings in Buffaloes that should have been write-offs, bringing them home through a combination of skill, stubbornness, and what he insisted was Scottish engineering intuition. The third member of the flight was Pilot Officer Robert Chen, a local volunteer whose knowledge of the straits and surrounding islands had already saved lives during reconnaissance missions. Robert was 23, the son of a Chinese merchant family that had lived in Singapore for 3 generations. He spoke English, Malay, and 3 Chinese dialects fluently, and his understanding of the local geography was encyclopedic. He could navigate by landmarks that other pilots couldn't even see, and he had an uncanny ability to find his way home even in the worst weather or after the most disorienting combat. Robert flew with a quiet intensity that Tim respected deeply, never showing the bravado that some younger pilots affected, but demonstrating through actions rather than words that he would give his life defending his home. His parents and 2 younger sisters were still in Singapore, unable to get space on any of the evacuation ships, and Tim knew that Robert was flying not just for Britain or the RAF, but for his family trapped in the city below. If you're finding this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more untold stories from history to life. What happened in the skies over Singapore that morning would later be studied in military academies around the world, not as an example of superior technology or overwhelming force, but as a masterclass in tactical innovation born from desperate necessity and the kind of creative thinking that only emerges when conventional approaches have failed repeatedly. Tim Harper had spent the previous 3 weeks not just flying patrols and combat missions, but studying every engagement report with an obsessive attention to detail that bordered on mania. He had requisitioned copies of every radio transcript from squadron operations, interviewed every pilot who had survived encounters with the Zero, and even spoken with ground observers who had watched the combats from below. He filled 3 notebooks with observations, diagrams, and analysis, working late into the nights by lamplight while other pilots tried to sleep or sought escape in alcohol and card games. He had noticed something that others had dismissed as random chance or pilot error, a pattern that became clearer with each new engagement he analyzed. The Japanese pilots, for all their skill and their aircraft's undeniable superiority, fought with a predictable methodology that rarely varied regardless of the tactical situation. They relied completely on their aircraft's advantages, committing almost immediately to turning dogfights where the Zero's extraordinary turning radius gave them an overwhelming edge. They attacked consistently from altitude advantages, dove through formations to scatter them, and used their superior speed to dictate not just the opening moves, but the entire tempo and terms of every engagement. It was textbook fighter tactics, executed with mechanical precision and iron discipline by pilots who had spent years perfecting their craft over the skies of China. But Tim had also noticed something else, something that gave him hope, even as Singapore crumbled around them. The Japanese pilots, perhaps because of their string of unbroken successes, perhaps because of the rigid training that had made them so effective, had become somewhat formulaic and predictable in their tactical approach. They expected their opponents to react in certain ways, to either try desperately to outturn them in the kind of dogfight where the Zero excelled, or to simply run in straight lines where they could be chased down and destroyed at leisure. What they didn't expect, what their training and experience had not prepared them for, was for their opponents to stop fighting like traditional fighter pilots following conventional doctrine and start thinking like prey animals that had learned to outsmart a more powerful predator through cunning rather than strength. Tim's idea was simple in concept, but absolutely terrifying in its practical execution, the kind of plan that only makes sense when all the conventional options have failed. Instead of trying to match the Zero's strengths, they would deliberately and systematically exploit its weaknesses by refusing entirely to engage on the enemy's preferred terms. The Buffalo couldn't outturn a Zero, that much was painfully obvious to anyone who had tried and survived to report the results. But it had one advantage that was often overlooked in the endless comparisons of speed, maneuverability, and rate of climb. It was built like an armored tank compared to the Zero's lightweight construction. The Wright Cyclone radial engine at the Buffalo's heart could absorb battle damage that would catastrophically cripple the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine. The airframe, while heavy and ungainly, was robust enough to withstand the stresses of violent maneuvering that might tear the wings off a more lightly built aircraft. If they could survive the initial contact and draw the enemy into a specific type of engagement that played to the Buffalo's strengths rather than its weaknesses, they might, just possibly, have a chance of not just surviving but actually winning. The four Buffaloes took off at 10:30 in the morning, their engines roaring to life one after another in a symphony of mechanical power that echoed across the airfield. Tim led the formation, his Buffalo laboring into the sky with its characteristic heavy feel, each foot of altitude gained through brute force rather than any kind of aerodynamic elegance. They climbed into the hazy sky above Singapore Island, the city below sprawling out in a patchwork of colonial architecture with its white-painted government buildings and red-tiled roofs intermixed with traditional local kampongs where tap-roofed houses clustered in organic patterns that defied Western urban planning. The harbor was crowded with ships of every description, from Royal Navy destroyers to civilian cargo vessels, all desperately trying to evacuate civilians and non-essential personnel before the Japanese ground forces arrived. From altitude, Tim could see the smoke rising from numerous fires in the city, testament to the previous night's bombing raid. Tim led his flight northeast, toward the Johor Strait that separated Singapore Island from the Malayan mainland, following a heading that would intercept the reported enemy formation. The radio crackled with terse updates from ground control, each transmission painting a progressively more ominous picture of what was heading their way. 24 aircraft, the controller reported, his voice tight with the strain of tracking multiple contacts on the primitive radar sets that had only recently been installed. A mix of bombers and fighters approaching from the north-northwest at an altitude of 15,000 feet, speed estimated at 180 knots. The formation was holding together tightly, suggesting a well-organized attack rather than a scattered raid. Tim's four Buffaloes against 24 Japanese aircraft with no possibility of reinforcement and no hope of escape if things went badly. The odds were not just unfavorable, they were absurd, suicidal even by the most optimistic assessment. But they had a plan, and more importantly, they had nothing left to lose, no reserve of equipment or personnel that might be saved for a more decisive battle. This was it, the last stand of the Buffalo Squadron at Kelang. They spotted the enemy formation at 20 minutes past 11, coming in from the north at 15,000 feet, exactly where ground control had predicted they would be. The Japanese had arranged themselves in a classic bomber escort pattern that had proven effective throughout their campaign in Southeast Asia, with 9 twin-engine Mitsubishi G3M bombers flying in a tight V formation, their aluminum skin glinting in the tropical sun. Surrounding the bombers were 15 Zero fighters flying in a protective screen arranged in loose pairs and sections, positioned to intercept any attacker from any angle. It was a formation designed to be impenetrable, with multiple overlapping fields of fire, and the fighters positioned to pounce within seconds on any enemy foolish enough to try reaching the bombers. Standard Allied doctrine, the tactics written into every training manual and briefed at every operations meeting, would call for the Buffaloes to try to break through the fighter screen using superior numbers or a favorable position, attack the bombers with a quick firing pass, and then attempt to escape before the escort fighters could exact revenge. But Tim had no intention whatsoever of following standard doctrine that had gotten dozens of good pilots killed in the past 2 months. As he watched the formation approach with the methodical precision of a machine, Tim keyed his radio and gave the order that would define not just this engagement, but the entire tactical approach that followed. Don't engage the fighters directly. Target only the bomber lead aircraft and break away immediately on my signal. Execute vertical separation maneuvers exactly as briefed. Trust your wingman. The other pilots acknowledged in sequence, their voices steady despite what they were about to attempt, despite knowing that a single mistake, a moment's hesitation, or a miscalculated angle could mean death. Graham's voice came through with his characteristic Australian accent. Ready to go, Skipper. Jack added his confirmation with typical economy. Aye, ready. Robert's response was simply, understood, ready to engage. The first pass was a masterpiece of controlled chaos that unfolded over perhaps 20 seconds of real time but would remain burned into each pilot's memory for the rest of their lives. Tim led his flight in from the side, not diving from above where the Zeros would have the immediate advantage of height and speed, but coming in level with the bombers at an angle that gave them only seconds of exposure to the fighter screen. The timing had to be perfect, the approach angle carefully calculated to minimize their time under fire while maximizing their firing opportunity against the bombers. Graham Morris was the first to fire, pressing his trigger at exactly the moment Tim had briefed, his 6 50-caliber machine guns ripping into the lead bomber's port engine with a stream of tracers that looked like deadly fireworks in the bright morning sun. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Fire blossomed along the wing as fuel lines ruptured and ignited, and the bomber began to lose altitude, trailing black smoke as its pilot fought to maintain control of a machine that was rapidly becoming unflyable. The Zeros reacted exactly as Tim had predicted during his countless hours of analysis, breaking formation with aggressive precision to pursue the buffaloes who had dared to attack their charges. But instead of turning to dogfight, which would have been suicide, or diving away in a straight line where they could be easily chased down and destroyed, Tim led his flight into a maneuver that defied everything the Japanese pilots expected based on their training and experience. He pulled into a steep climbing turn not tight enough to bleed off all their precious speed in a single rotation, but angled precisely in such a way that the pursuing Zeros had to make an immediate tactical decision. They could follow in a similar climb, which would neutralize their primary advantage of superior maneuverability and horizontal turns, or they could try to cut them off by taking a different angle, which meant losing visual sight of their targets momentarily and potentially ending up in a disadvantaged position. The Japanese chose to follow in the climb, and that tactical decision was their first critical mistake of the engagement. The Buffalo's Wright Cyclone radial engine, for all its documented faults including chronic overheating and mediocre power output, was genuinely powerful in sustained vertical climbs when pushed to maximum power settings. The Zeros, lighter and vastly more agile in horizontal maneuvering, were actually at a significant disadvantage in a sustained vertical climb at high entry speed, where raw engine power mattered more than aerodynamic efficiency. Tim held the climb with his throttle pushed to the firewall, feeling the Buffalo shake and shudder from the strain, his airspeed indicator unwinding rapidly as gravity and drag bled off their velocity. He held it until his airspeed began to drop into the dangerously low range where the Buffalo would lose all control authority and potentially enter an unrecoverable stall. Then, at precisely the calculated moment, he pushed the nose down and rolled hard right, not into a sharp turn that would further reduce their speed, but into a split S maneuver that sent his Buffalo diving back toward the ground in an arc that traded altitude for desperately needed speed. The maneuver was inherently risky, the kind of violent aerobatics that stressed the airframe to its design limits and beyond. But it created crucial separation from the pursuing Zeros, whose pilots had expected another climb, or perhaps a turn attempt. By the time the Japanese pilots had fully processed what was happening, reoriented their mental picture of the engagement, and started their own diving maneuvers to pursue, Tim's flight was already pulling out of the dive at low altitude and climbing again from a completely different angle and position. The vertical separation had been achieved, temporarily disrupting the Zeros' ability to bring their superior turning performance to bear. The sequence of violent vertical maneuvers became the defining pattern for the next 17 minutes of sustained combat, a battle that would exhaust all four pilots both physically and mentally. The Buffaloes would make a coordinated quick pass at the bombers, inflict whatever damage they could in the brief seconds their guns were on target, then immediately execute a series of carefully rehearsed vertical maneuvers that prevented the Zeros from establishing the kind of sustained horizontal turning fight where their superior maneuverability would inevitably doom the Buffaloes. It was exhausting flying that demanded absolute precision and pushed both the pilots and their aircraft to the absolute limits of what they could endure. Jack Patterson's Buffalo was hit twice during the fifth pass, bullets puncturing his wing root and tail section, leaving ragged holes that disrupted the airflow and made his aircraft increasingly difficult to control, but the tough airframe held together through sheer structural integrity. Robert Chen managed to set a second bomber on fire during the eighth pass, a perfectly aimed burst that ignited the aircraft's fuel tanks, forcing its crew to bail out over the jungle below, where they would face an uncertain fate among the hostile terrain. The Japanese formation, so confident and tightly organized at the start of the engagement, was gradually fragmenting as the bomber pilots began to panic at the repeated attacks they couldn't escape, and the Zero pilots grew increasingly frustrated, trying to pin down enemies who absolutely refused to fight according to any tactics they had trained against or encountered before. You could see the formation discipline beginning to crack as individual pilots made aggressive moves that left gaps in the defensive screen. The turning point came at 11:37, at a moment when the engagement might have continued indefinitely in this pattern of attack and evasion. One of the Zero pilots, either significantly more aggressive or considerably more experienced than the others in his formation, managed to predict Tim's next maneuver through some combination of instinct and pattern recognition. He positioned himself with remarkable skill into what pilots call a perfect deflection position, an angle that allowed him to fire not at where Tim's Buffalo was, but at where it would be in the next split second. Tim saw the tracers coming, those distinctive glowing lines that marked the path of bullets traveling at supersonic velocities, and knew with absolute certainty that he couldn't avoid them all no matter what maneuver he executed. Time seemed to slow in that moment, the way it often does in combat when death becomes not just possible but probable. Bullets hammered into his Buffalo's engine, cowling with a sound like someone hitting a steel drum with a sledgehammer. The impacts transmitted through the airframe as physical shocks that he could feel through the control stick. Immediately, the cylinder head temperature gauge began to climb rapidly toward the red line, and black smoke started streaming from the cowling, mixing with the heat haze from the damaged engine to create an ominous trail that marked his position in the sky like a signal flare. He was hit, possibly fatally for the aircraft if not for himself, and every instinct told him to break off the engagement immediately and head for base, hoping to make it back before the engine seized completely or caught fire. Standard operating procedure, drilled into every pilot from their first day of training, dictated that a damaged aircraft should disengage from combat and attempt to return to base while still flyable. But Tim Harper had not come this far, had not spent 3 weeks developing these tactics, had not put his wingmen at risk to follow standard operating procedure now. Instead, in a decision that could only be described as either brilliantly calculated or absolutely insane depending on the outcome, he pushed the damaged Buffalo into another climb, this time trailing smoke that made him an unmistakably obvious target, a wounded animal that any predator would instinctively pursue. Graham Morris understood immediately what Tim was doing. The smoking, struggling Buffalo was bait, designed to draw the Zeros into a trap. Graham positioned his own aircraft above and behind Tim's wounded plane, waiting. 3 Zeros took the bait, diving on what they thought was an easy kill. They focused entirely on Tim's Buffalo, ignoring everything else as they lined up for the final attack. That single-minded focus cost them dearly. Graham dove from above and behind, his guns blazing. The lead Zero disintegrated under the concentrated fire, pieces of wing and fuselage scattering across the sky. The second Zero, suddenly aware of the threat, tried to break left, but Jack Patterson was already there, having followed Graham's dive. Jack's guns tore into the Zero's engine and cockpit, and the Japanese plane spiraled away toward the ground. The third Zero pilot, showing impressive skill and courage, managed to evade both attacks and attempted to pursue Graham through his dive. This was exactly what Robert Chen had been waiting for. He had positioned his Buffalo in a shallow climb parallel to the engagement, and as the Zero committed to chasing Graham, Robert pulled a high deflection shot that seemed almost impossible given the angles involved. His guns fired for less than 2 seconds, but it was enough. The Zero's canopy shattered, and the aircraft went into an uncontrolled roll before the pilot managed to bail out, his parachute deploying just seconds before impact. The remaining Japanese fighters, having lost 3 of their number in less than 30 seconds, and with their bomber formation in disarray, made the decision to withdraw. It wasn't a panicked retreat, but an organized disengagement that showed the professionalism of their training. They regrouped, covered the surviving bombers, and headed back north toward their bases in Japanese-held territory. Tim's Buffalo was still flying, though barely. The engine was making sounds that no engine should make, and the cockpit was filling with smoke from somewhere behind the instrument panel. He nursed the stricken aircraft back toward Kelang, losing altitude steadily, while the other 3 Buffaloes formed up around him in a protective escort. They landed 15 minutes later, Tim's Buffalo touching down with flames now visible from the engine. The ground crew rushed forward with fire extinguishers as Tim shut down the dying engine and climbed out of the cockpit. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the physical strain of the engagement. The other pilots gathered around, equally exhausted, as the ground crew chief approached with a damage assessment that was both impressive and sobering. Tim's Buffalo would never fly again. The engine was destroyed. The airframe had stress fractures from the violent maneuvering, and there were 37 bullet holes in the fuselage and wings. Graham's plane had taken minor damage, a few bullets through the tail section. Jack's Buffalo needed a new wing and stabilizer. Robert's aircraft was relatively unscathed, just superficial damage from shell fragments. Wing Commander Davies arrived as the pilots were debriefing with intelligence officers. His expression was unreadable as he listened to their account of the engagement. When they finished, he was silent for a long moment before speaking. 4 obsolete fighters against 24 Japanese aircraft. 3 enemy fighters confirmed destroyed. 2 bombers destroyed. 3 more bombers damaged badly enough that they likely didn't make it home. No losses on our side, though 1 aircraft destroyed by battle damage. The intelligence officers exchanged glances, clearly skeptical of the claims, despite the physical evidence scattered across the airfield. Davies turned to Tim, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and genuine curiosity. How did you do it? How did 4 Buffaloes defeat pilots flying what we all agree is the best fighter in the Pacific? Tim's answer was detailed but straightforward. They had stopped trying to fight the Zero on its terms, and instead created a new set of terms that negated the enemy's advantages. The vertical maneuvers prevented the Zeros from establishing the sustained turning dogfights where they excelled. The hit-and-run attacks on the bombers forced the Japanese fighters to react rather than dictate the engagement. The apparent bait of a damaged aircraft drew the enemy into a trap that exploited their natural aggression. Most importantly, they had fought as a coordinated team, with each pilot trusting the others to be in position when needed. It wasn't about individual skill or superior technology. It was about tactical innovation, mutual trust, and a willingness to abandon conventional doctrine when conventional doctrine was getting people killed. The news of the engagement spread quickly through the squadron, and then through the entire air defense network defending Singapore. Pilots who had been flying with resignation, expecting to die in outdated aircraft against superior opponents, suddenly saw a glimmer of hope. If 4 Buffaloes could pull it off, perhaps there was a way to survive, perhaps even to win. Davies ordered Tim to conduct briefings for every fighter pilot at Kelang, sharing the tactics and the reasoning behind them. Over the next 3 days, as the Japanese ground forces drew closer to Singapore, these tactics were refined and expanded. Other pilots added their own variations, adapting the core concepts to different situations and enemy formations. But innovation alone couldn't change the strategic reality. Singapore was falling, the ground defenses were crumbling, the water supply had been cut, and the Japanese were preparing for a final assault on the city. On February 15th, just 7 days after the engagement, the British forces in Singapore surrendered to the Japanese. It was the largest surrender of British-led forces in history, and it marked the effective end of colonial power in Southeast Asia. Tim Harper, Graham Morris, Jack Patterson, and Robert Chen were evacuated to Java in the final days, along with what remained of their squadron. They left behind their damaged Buffaloes, the airfield at Kelang, and a city that had been their home. The story might have ended there, just another footnote in the larger tragedy of Singapore's fall. But the tactics they had developed lived on. Intelligence officers who had witnessed the engagement wrote detailed reports that made their way to Australia, India, and eventually to the United States. The reports caught the attention of training commands who were desperately trying to find ways to combat the Zero's dominance in the Pacific. The vertical maneuvers, the hit-and-run attacks, the coordinated team tactics, all of it was analyzed and incorporated into fighter training programs. By mid-1942, American pilots were learning variations of the same tactics that Tim Harper had improvised in desperation over Singapore. Perhaps the most notable adoption came from the American volunteer group in China, better known as the Flying Tigers. Claire Chennault, their commander, received copies of the Singapore engagement reports and recognized immediately the value of what Tim's flight had accomplished. The Flying Tigers were flying P-40 Warhawks, which, like the Buffalo, were inferior to the Zero in many respects. Chennault incorporated the vertical fighting tactics into his training program, emphasizing the importance of maintaining energy through vertical maneuvers rather than trying to turn fight with the Zeros. The Flying Tigers' success in defending China's supply lines owed a debt to the lessons learned over Singapore. The same tactics influenced the development of the Thatch Weave, a defensive maneuver created by American naval aviator John Thatch. While Thatch developed his technique independently, the reports from Singapore validated the core principle that coordinated team tactics could overcome individual technical disadvantages. The Thatch Weave became standard doctrine for American Navy fighter pilots and saved countless lives in the battles that followed. From Midway to the Marianas, American pilots used these coordinated tactics to neutralize the Zero's advantages and achieve air superiority in the Pacific. Tim Harper survived the war, though the journey from that morning over Singapore to peace in 1945 was long, difficult, and marked by experiences that would shape the rest of his life in ways both visible and invisible. After evacuating from Java, just hours ahead of the Japanese invasion force, traveling on an overcrowded destroyer that somehow made it through waters thick with enemy submarines and aircraft, he served in India and Burma, initially training new pilots in the tactics he had developed, but eventually returning to combat operations himself. The memories of Singapore, of that morning's engagement, of the men he had lost, all of it followed him through every subsequent mission. He flew combat missions over Burma in Hurricanes and later in Spitfires, aircraft that were so vastly superior to the Buffalo that they almost felt like different species of machine, but which still benefited immeasurably from the tactical innovations he had pioneered out of desperation and necessity over Singapore. The RAF recognized his contributions with the Distinguished Flying Cross, presented at a ceremony in Calcutta in October 1943, though the full details of the Singapore engagement weren't declassified until decades later when the war was long over, and most of the participants were aging men for whom the battles had become distant memories. The citation for his DFC was deliberately vague, mentioning exceptional courage and tactical innovation without specifying exactly what he had done or how 4 obsolete fighters had defeated 24 enemy aircraft. After the war finally ended in August 1945, Tim returned to England on a troopship crowded with servicemen all trying to process what they had survived and what kind of future awaited them in a Britain that had been fundamentally changed by 6 years of total war. He married Helen, a nurse he had known before the war, who had waited for him through 5 years of sporadic letters and long silences, and they built a life together that was outwardly normal and quiet. They had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter who grew up knowing their father had been a pilot in the war, but never really understanding what that meant, because Tim rarely spoke about those years. He worked as a commercial pilot for British Overseas Airways Corporation, flying routes to the Far East and Australia that sometimes took him near Singapore, though he never felt any desire to visit the city where he had fought and nearly died. At night, sometimes, Helen would wake to find him standing at the window, looking out at nothing in particular, lost in memories he couldn't or wouldn't share. The war had marked him, as it marked all who survived it, in ways that couldn't be explained to those who hadn't been there. Graham Morris also survived, though he was shot down over Burma in 1943 and spent 2 years as a prisoner of war. He returned to Australia after the war, deeply affected by his experiences in captivity, but determined to build a normal life. He worked as a flying instructor for decades, passing on not just the technical skills of flying, but the tactical lessons he had learned. Jack Patterson was killed in action over Java in March 1942, just weeks after the Singapore evacuation. His Buffalo was hit by anti-aircraft fire while attacking a Japanese airfield, and he died in the crash. Robert Chen's fate remained unknown for many years. He was last seen defending an evacuation convoy from Japanese bombers and was presumed killed in action. Decades later, records suggested he may have survived the war as a prisoner but died in captivity before repatriation. The Buffalo itself never escaped its reputation as an inadequate fighter. It was withdrawn from frontline service as soon as better aircraft became available, and by the end of 1942, no Allied Air Force was still flying Buffaloes in combat. The aircraft that had been rejected by the U.S. Navy and had struggled so badly in the Pacific found a second life in Finland, where Finnish pilots used it successfully against Soviet aircraft on the Eastern Front. But in the Pacific theater, it remained a symbol of unpreparedness and the cost of entering the war with outdated equipment. What changed wasn't the aircraft's reputation, but the understanding of what was possible when pilots thought beyond conventional doctrine. The engagement over Singapore on February 8th became a case study in several military concepts. It demonstrated the importance of tactical flexibility, the value of coordinating team actions over individual heroics, and the potential for innovation under pressure. Military historians have analyzed the engagement from multiple angles, examining the vertical fighting tactics, the psychological aspects of refusing to engage on the enemy's terms, and the way that desperation can drive creative problem solving. The engagement has been compared to other battles, where technically inferior forces achieved victory through tactical innovation, from the Battle of Salamis to the Battle of Britain. Perhaps the most important lesson, one that remains relevant in modern military doctrine, is that technological superiority can be neutralized by tactical innovation. The Zero was undoubtedly a better aircraft than the Buffalo by almost every measurable standard. But in the hands of pilots who understood both their own aircraft's limitations and their enemy's predictable patterns, even obsolete equipment could achieve victories. This lesson has been relearned repeatedly throughout military history, from Vietnam to Afghanistan, wherever technologically advanced forces have struggled against opponents who refuse to fight conventionally. The 4 pilots flying 4 obsolete Buffaloes didn't change the outcome of the war in Singapore. The city still fell, the British Empire in Asia still collapsed, and the Japanese still achieved their strategic objectives. But what they did accomplish was perhaps more important in the long term. They proved that the Zero was not invincible, that Japanese pilots could be outmaneuvered and defeated, and that tactical innovation could level the playing field even when the equipment was inadequate. That message, that hope, spread through the Allied air forces at a time when morale was at its lowest and the war seemed unwinnable. In the decades since, the engagement has been studied, analyzed, and debated. Some historians have questioned the exact number of Japanese aircraft shot down, noting that Japanese records from that period are incomplete. Others have suggested that the tactical innovations attributed to Tim Harper may have been developing independently in multiple locations. These academic debates are valuable, but they shouldn't obscure the central historical reality. On the morning of February 8, 1942, 4 pilots and obsolete fighters used tactical innovation to defeat a numerically superior force flying superior aircraft. They did so through coordination, creative thinking, and a willingness to abandon doctrine when doctrine wasn't working. The simple trick that the title refers to wasn't really simple at all. It required understanding the enemy's psychology, recognizing patterns in their tactics, identifying the specific weaknesses in their approach, and then having the courage and skill to execute a plan that relied on each pilot trusting the others completely. It required Tim Harper to use his own damaged aircraft as bait, Graham Morris to position himself perfectly for an ambush, Jack Patterson to be in exactly the right place at the right moment, and Robert Chen to make an almost impossible deflection shot. It required all of them to push their aircraft beyond normal limits, while maintaining the situational awareness needed to coordinate their actions in the chaos of combat. The engine of Tim's Buffalo, the one that carried him through the engagement despite being damaged, was eventually recovered from the wreckage at Kelang after the war. It sits now in a museum in Singapore, a monument to both the inadequacy of the equipment Britain sent to defend her colonies and the ingenuity of the pilots who flew it anyway. The placard next to it tells the story of the engagement, though in abbreviated form. Visitors walk past it daily, most unaware of the larger historical significance, seeing only an old engine from an obsolete aircraft. But for those who study military aviation, for fighter pilots who train on tactics that trace their lineage back to that morning over Singapore, the engagement represents something profound. It represents the moment when the Allied forces in the Pacific stopped accepting the Zero's dominance and started finding ways to fight back effectively. It represents the power of tactical innovation over technological superiority. Most importantly, it represents the courage of 4 pilots who, when given every reason to expect defeat, found a way to win anyway. The morning of February 8, 1942, began with 4 obsolete Buffaloes facing impossible odds. It ended with those same 4 aircraft landing safely while their enemies retreated. In between was 17 minutes of combat that would influence fighter tactics for the remainder of the war and beyond. The pilots who fought that day weren't superhuman. Their aircraft weren't suddenly transformed into superior machines. What changed was their approach to the problem, their willingness to innovate under pressure, and their trust in each other. That was the simple trick that defeated Japan's best pilots. Not magic, not luck, but tactical innovation, coordination, and the courage to try something different when conventional wisdom said there was no hope. In the end, that made all the difference.